This is the Andrew Lake Podcast, and in this episode, we're talking about what is high culture. What is high culture? I think for some people, the first thing that comes to mind is the weed smoking community. Of course, this is high culture. It's the pun. It's the friends in high places. But as we keep talking, we'll see that this is actually a subculture, or at least I would categorize it as a subculture rather than a high culture. First off, I think we should discuss what culture is. So the textbook definition of culture is the customs, pastimes, activities, rituals, and entertainment of a society. I want to split our definition of culture into two so that we can have a working definition and we can have a larger definition. So the larger definition would be all of the behaviors of a given civilization, or all of the activities of a society. And that would be the broad definition. And the working definition I want to use here is more towards just the entertainment and the spare time way that a society or community spends their extra hours. So, to be perhaps a bit more clear, culture is not economics. Culture is not the mode of production. It's not the values or the resources of a civilization. It's not the politics or the organizational or conscious organizational of a collective or a civilization. And it's not so much the rituals and the customs. What we're trying to focus more here on is the activities of entertainment. It would be how you spend your attention when you're not focusing on your politics and your economics and your survival. A cultural activity, we might say, is something that holds your attention for a certain amount of time. It does something with your attention. It picks it up, takes it on a ride, and sets it back down. For example, watching a movie. So there's a process to going through the ride or the journey of watching a movie. You sit down, you chomp on your popcorn, the lights dim. If you're at the cinema, this is particularly the case. And then you follow that point of attention of the storyline across different areas and complications in the plot, and that is the flavors that you get with your attention span. The same thing can be said of sports. Now, there are rituals and customs surrounding sports. You dress a certain way, you go into the stadium, there are certain opening ceremonies, we sing the national anthem, shake hands, toss a coin, and then your attention is focused on that single point, and it goes high, it goes low, it's got twists and turns, it's got complications, it's got tension and release, and at the very end there's a resolution, and it's either a tragedy or a victory for either side, depending on your emotional investment in the cultural activity. So that's our working definition of culture. And what I want to do is divide our second word into a few things. So we're not just going to talk about high culture, but we want to also be aware of subculture. Before we get onto that, we should possibly discuss popular culture. So popular culture is the sport and the movies and the music and the entertainment that the majority of people do. It's the one that appeals to the largest audience. It's the one that is pretty commonly accepted, and if you bring it up in conversation, it's pretty stock standard stuff, and it's a pretty safe conversation starter. And we've also got an obvious way of looking at popular culture when we see our music. It's our celebrities, the top 40 charts, the platinum albums, the big rock concert stadiums, and the TV shows or the music video clips and the viral videos on the internet. So if you ever want to distinguish between popular culture and subculture, you can simply ask yourself, is this entertainment also on the other side of the country? So that would be covering a lot of sports, because a lot of our sports are national and a lot of our music is also national. And of course, movies are on a national or international stage. So if you are involved in a form of entertainment and you ask yourself that question, you can distinguish whether it's a popular culture or a subculture by seeing how many people are involved in it. Subculture is more about a local community. It's more about a less amount of people and a in-group and out-group sort of dynamic. For example, you've got the goth culture. You've got the gym culture or healthy lifestyle culture. There might be, as a way of example, BDSM. I'm not sure what that stands for, but that's another skew that we can use for subculture. Skateboarding culture is another one which spreads off sports, because we've got our mainstream sports and then we've got our individual sports. So people don't go to see their skateboarding teams, they go to see individual skateboarders. Skateboarding is quite a large cultural phenomenon, don't get me wrong, but it skews more towards the subculture. Just like water sports. In music, it's quite easy to see what is a subculture. We might have punk music, or blues, or opera, or reggae, or techno music, or minimalism music, or classical music, or rap music. Rap music's a bit different because it has risen up into the popular culture and made itself prominent at the forefront of our entertainment. But that would be another example of a subculture blossoming into a popular culture phenomenon. Some subcultures are set in a time, so they develop through the mainstream and then they become institutionalized, such as classical music or opera. So there was a time when opera was the mainstream. It was the forefront of entertainment. It was the popular culture of its day. And then its characteristics and its flavors became solidified and stuck as they are with their in-group, out-group dynamic. And then they became a historical subculture. So there's a lot of examples of this, and you can just work out how long a form of entertainment has been around to work out whether it is a subculture or some subcultures are quite new as well. They would be more like trends. For example, those fidget spinners haven't been around for very long, but they are a subculture or a cultural trend. I think trends are a bit different to actual cultural activities. I mean, we can refine our definition of attention stimulation down to many different levels, but I think what we're really trying to get at here is your hobby, what you spend your weekend doing, your time being entertained on a regular basis. Another way subcultures are catalyzed is through geographical place. So this is obvious in music. Some music springs out of certain countries. So you might have Afro music, or you might have traditional music, you might have indigenous music, and these spring up and become solidified and institutionalized just like they do just sort of like the classical music and opera music do in time. Some subcultures get set in a place, and then they become subcultures that are exported to other parts of the world. I think reggae would be a really good example of that, because reggae is now part of the popular culture, and yet it was from a time and a place, and it has its own characteristics that are solidified. There's a few things that I can skew to have cross-cultural elements to them. For example, tattoo culture. So that might be a subculture in our list, and tattoos can be expressions of many things. They might be tribal tattoos, they might be gym tattoos, they might be gambling or card playing tattoos, or they might be prison tattoos. So prison life is another subculture, and well, it's not really something that they take on as a form of entertainment. That might be outside our definition of what culture is. But you can see by skewering tattoos, we've got a whole bunch of subcultures that cross over with one another. So we've got our idea of popular culture, and then we've got our examples of subculture. Popular culture is what the majority of people do, and then the subculture is what a community or isolated group of people do. And that brings us nicely to high culture. So high culture is how I want to define it as brazen elitism, the rejection of popular culture, a move towards complexity, and the embracing of the in-group, out-group dynamic, which is subtle in the subculture. Subcultures have their own terms and their own dynamics, which you really need to be introduced gradually to understand and to be a part of. High culture really makes that obvious and clear. There's no way you are going to be able to be a part of something that is high culture unless you definitely have that set of terms, definitions, and ways of acting, that understanding. High culture, in a sense, or what I'm basically trying to say is high culture totally includes its exclusivity. What I'm trying to say is high culture embraces exclusivity. So, for example, jazz music. That is much more complicated than your typical pop music. It's much less accessible. To understand it, you need to have an appreciation of the mechanics of it, how it is made, what goes into the thought processes that make it, what sort of ideas it is expressing, what devices construct that music. And to be able to listen to something like free jazz or avant-garde jazz, you need to have a complexity and understanding and a amount of built-up experience that leads to your ability to understanding the complexity. Well, here's another way to put it. Pop music is shit. Look, it is. It's just shit. It's plastic. It's produced. It's overly contrived. It's about these generic appeals to love and basic emotions. It's just plastic. It's shit. Or at least not compared to jazz music. Jazz music is rich and complicated and earthy. It's got that vibe to it that has subtlety and depth. And it's just, look, I don't care. It's just Jazz music is better than pop music, all right? Let's just leave it there. Another way that we can skew this difference between popular culture, subculture, and high culture is with art. So art is a mode of stimulating your attention, and there are different degrees of complexity in how someone understands art. Popular art would be that statement which is obvious. It's the really clear-cut and black and white thing that you can see. If you look at it, you can see what it is. Oh, that's a painting of a person. That's a painting of a situation. That's a painting of an event. Whereas sub-art or subculture art might have its own sets of methods which are particular to certain personalities, and they're not always complex or obvious. They have differing degrees of those parameters, but they are set in their own sort of way. So you have art which is more towards your tastes and your own personal preference. This does bring to bear the question, well, how do you decide if your subculture is not a high culture? And the only difference I'm making here is in the degree of complexity and the entry level into understanding. So jazz music has a lot of history and historical references bearing on its composition in where it is made today. So for you to be able to appreciate the cultural references in jazz music, you have to have a long understanding of where it's come from and what the history is like. So that rules out all our cultural trends as high culture. Fashion is another example that we can use to skewer our definitions. Fashion is quite an interesting one because we all wear clothes and we all have an opinion about what looks good. We all have a differing degree of how much we put our personality into our clothes. I think perhaps fashion is a bit like food in that it's something that we all do, and it's more towards the customs and rituals and activities rather than the entertainment and attention stimulation side of our definition of what culture is. And now we come to the question, what does it mean to go beyond culture? What does it mean to be a self-made person, an original person? What can we learn from visionaries, leaders, and the original creators and innovators of our society? How conscious are we of choosing the way we spend our entertainment hours? And if we were more conscious of how we were spending our time, what would be the best way to spend that time? Would it be on popular culture? Would it be on certain subcultures? Or would it be on high culture? Certainly, exploring subcultures and involving yourself in different activities and finding different hobbies is an important part of riding these waves towards becoming a self-made person. And perhaps that's the certain charm in someone who is a self-made millionaire. It's because he eats whatever food he wants. He dresses in clothes that he's bought for himself. He entertains himself with things that are more expensive and harder for the common person to get their hands on. But In my mind, there's a distinction between high class and high culture. An expensive sports car is high class, but I'd still categorize that as a subculture. I don't know if a wealthy self-made millionaire is automatically made himself as a self-made high culture participant. There's a cultural taste or aesthetic intelligence which is unable to be bought with any amount of money. How one progresses through economic expansion, or what it means to make more and more money, might be a way of bringing to answer this question of how you want to spend your entertainment time. And affluence can be a hindrance to exploring subcultures and high culture. Because if you just follow popular culture with more and more money, you don't end up with those finer subtleties, the complexities, and the deeper appreciations of what a society has to offer. Money can buy a hell of a lot of things, but it can't buy an appreciation. As children, we do what our parents do. We do what our family does. We do our family activities. As we get a little bit older, we start to see that there's a small gap between the things we think, do, say, and feel, and what our parents do. And at a certain time, a child realizes that there are things inside its head that are not inside its parents' head. It's starting to take a few steps towards independence. And usually around early adolescence, the young teenager realizes that the parents are just part of a community. There are other parents that have different ideas, different things they do, different ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. And we all, to a different degree, start to rebel when we have this realization. Because, of course, when your parents are only one way of doing things, it makes it most likely that they're not doing it the right way. Depending on family dynamics, there are different amounts of rebellion. I know I was very rebellious. And when middle teens rebel, they try to find things on their own way. They try to do things in opposition to their parents. And it's when they come to the end of school that they see that they're going to have to enter into a community and a society and adopt a role which will bring them survival and success, or a way of working and operating and acting that will be sustainable. If the young adult can adapt to their community and their society, they can take on a role which is fulfilling of that need to sustain themselves. And we all have varying degrees of success of that. We all have different ways of doing that. There's something quite beautiful in someone who steps into a role that they were made for, and they do it quite well. And there is something quite repulsive about someone who's in the wrong job, and it's obvious to everyone around them. But if we continue our story along the line, there comes a point where the person in the role realizes that there are many roles, and they're all trying to get at this mode of being, this mode of entertainment or survival, or the most optimal way of existing. And that's when one can start to notice that their society is not the best way of doing things. the mainstream is not the most optimal way of doing things. And that's when we might get angry. That's when we might get angry at the fast foods and the pop music and the cheesy entertainment of blockbuster films. But then you're faced with a bigger problem, which is that we are all human. We're all part of this condition, which is being a human. And there are things that we respond to which are characteristics of humanity. What does it mean to go beyond that? What does it mean to recognize that we're human and that we all have different ways of responding to our humanity? Can we take it another step even further and say, what does it mean to exist? What does it mean to be alive? What is my response to being in this grand condition that I have? Are my cultural manifestations just attempts to deal with that bigger truth? Career is a good way of skewering this line of development. It's very hard to find a career that is connected to this fact that we are working towards the quality of our existence. Another line that I'd like to poke through is that of friendship. Now, at each stage of development, friendship means a different thing. When you're a child, are you friends with your parents? Well, yes. But friendship there means something very different to when you're an adult. When you're an adult, you don't really have to be friends with your parents. Are you friends with your workmates? Well, yes, if you've got a friendly workplace environment, that is. But would that friendship extend beyond the workplace? And you can see in some subcultures, there are really deep friendships that are made because they're sharing these activities which are very exclusive. People who are involved in high culture would make friends with the other people that are involved in higher culture. But let's take this idea of friendship all the way through to the very end, realizing that we're all human. Now, if we can notice that, then we don't need to say that one friend ends and another begins. We can say that we all have something in common and we're all responding to the same situation. We've, as it were, expanded our identity so far that we can have an existential community, a global community, a community of existence. Now, what does it look like to realize that we're all existing? Is it too far off and too grandiose to have any practical application? Is it too off in the clouds? I mean, I still have to go to work. I still have to pay the bills. I have to pay rent. I think there is a subtle difference between knowing what the background of all culture is and participating in culture as if it were the be-all and end-all. Now, if we take, for example, something like sports, people can become very violent over sports, and that's because the attention that is being taken on its ride is so closely identified to the person on that ride that they truly believe that that sport is every single thing to them. Now, I want to be careful here in explaining that when we disidentify something from ourselves, that doesn't devalue it. The initial intuition is that I either have to care really hard about something. I have to really care about my sports team. I have to really be on board with it. I have to be emotionally invested in the outcome of the game. And that is what brings meaning. If I don't care, if I disengage, then it will be meaningless to me. I won't be able to enjoy it. I won't be able to get that payoff when they win. I won't be able to have that feeling, and my attention won't be able to go on that ride. It won't be able to be stimulated. But there's a third option, and that is to be disidentified with it, but to still be engaged with it. We want to move towards that complexity. We want to be able to step back and have our rides of attention small in our field of awareness, and yet also be able to be engaged and connected with that ride of attention in a more passionate way. So think about what cultural activities you're involved in. Is it popular culture? Is it high culture? Is it subculture? Or are you keeping a thing in the back of your mind which is beyond culture? Because when you do that, you can still participate in popular culture. I still like popular culture. I like pop music. I'm a big fan of some of those mainstream guys and girls. But I'd like us to move towards being able to do that with a deeper common understanding, which is that we all exist and we're all human. And we all have fundamentally the same interest in stimulating our attention and entertaining ourselves on the weekend off. Thanks very much for tuning in. That's all I have to say for today. My name is Andrew. I'm going to go and listen to some pop music, I think. Who's on the top 40 today?